I was wondering if we could just kind of put this moment in some historical context. We have a very conservative court. They've made extremely important decisions on presidential power, civil rights, and more. But can you talk with us about the dynamics on the court and how this court fits into history and might be a break with it?
Yeah, so it's certainly the most conservative court since the early New Deal days when the Supreme Court regularly struck down a lot of FDR's measures to try to end the Great Depression. And it's an interesting dynamic because even though there are 6 Republican appointed conservative justices, they do have kind of different views and different approaches that can lead to fractures like we saw in the tariffs case. So I would say that Justices Alito and Thomas are just the most sort of MAGA justices, right? They are very, very political, super partisan, and almost always vote to support Trump's agenda. Thomas, a bit less so than Alito, but they're pretty much in the same boat these days. Unfortunately, I would say that lately, Justice Brett Kavanaugh has been kind of joining them in a lot of these high-profile cases. The tariffs case was proof that Kavanaugh has been drifting rightward for several years and seems to be very supportive of Trump's agenda from the bench. And then you have Justice Gorsuch, who is kind of a wild card. He can be political. He can be extraordinarily conservative on issues like voting rights and abortion, but then he can be sort of liberal in surprising ways on things like native rights, in recent cases, presidential power sometimes, in other cases, not so much. He's a wild card. It's hard to guess. And then you have Barrett and Roberts, who are sort of the moderates, like duo, who hold a lot of power in their hands these days because they're the deciders when a case comes down to them, and they can sort of steer the court to the right or toward the middle, and they can always join with the 3 liberals to try to reach like a compromise, or they can side with the other Republican appointees to, go big and issue a really major victory for the Republican Party. And more often than not, to be clear, they go big and issue major victories for the Republican Party. Like, I don't want the tariffs case to make people think that this is a moderate court or even a court that's regularly standing up to Trump. I mean, one of the issues that maybe we can discuss is the rise of these emergency decisions on the so-called shadow docket, where you see over and over again the 6 Republican appointed justices siding with Trump, often without an opinion, right? Sometimes issuing decisions late at night without explaining themselves, clearing the way for Trump to implement some extreme part of his agenda. And so we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that more often than not, the conservative majority is rowing in the same direction as Trump, but there are still some areas where they'll break from Trump, sometimes just to show him that they are independent and still have their own power they can sort of wield against him. And those are the areas where there's hope for Democrats in a decision that's not full MAGA.
Yeah, talk with us a little bit more about that shadow docket, because the use of it really seems to have exploded during Trump's second term.
Yeah, so for centuries, the Supreme Court operated in like the same way, right? They take up certain cases, they hold oral arguments, they have full briefing, they issue written opinions. We know how all the justices voted, they explain themselves. In the last 5 years or so, we have seen a kind of turbocharging of this alternate way of doing things that is often called the shadow docket, where the justices don't hold oral arguments. They don't have full briefing. They don't ever discuss a case at conference. Like, they don't sit down and sort of hash out their views. They just get a request, more often than not, from the Trump administration these days. And we don't know if it's by email or fax or text or whatever. They just say, here's how we're going to do this. And they do it. And they issue some kind of major order without, again, more often than not, explaining what they're doing, and allow for one party to prevail. And sometimes it's an absolutely huge win, and we don't even know why it happened because the court didn't explain. So much of Trump's immigration agenda has been greenlit over the shadow docket. The court has used the shadow docket to authorize ICE and CBP to engage in racial profiling when detaining suspected undocumented immigrants, to focus on people who appear to be Hispanic or who speak Spanish. the court has used the shadow docket to allow the Trump administration to deport immigrants to countries they've never stepped foot in, places like South Sudan and Uganda that are so dangerous that the government tells Americans not even to travel there. We're deporting people there right now because the Supreme Court allowed the government to do that. And the court allowed Trump to really kind of restructure the government by seizing power from Congress to do things like abolish the Department of Education, right? By firing hundreds or thousands of workers. These mass layoffs and so-called reductions in force that were never approved by Congress that are done illegally. These efforts to withhold billions of dollars in spending that Congress appropriated, the Supreme Court has allowed all of that, and it's done so over the shadow docket without explaining why.
Mark, I was really struck by you using the term MAGA justices, because it was not so long ago that we kind of believed in this quaint idea that even though Supreme Court justices were appointed by presidents who were Democrats or Republicans, that their politics were kind of supposed to end when they put on the robe. You wouldn't see justices giving political speeches, for instance, like we have quite frequently from Samuel Alito in particular. Can you talk with us about how this change came about, and to the point that it's really not even something that we acknowledge? We just kind of take it for granted now.
Yeah. So, I mean, one sort of reference point I like to remind people of is that in Clinton v. Jones, in the 1997 case, the Supreme Court ruled against Bill Clinton and said he didn't have immunity from Paula Jones' litigation against him. He wound up having to testify, answer all of these questions, right? That was a unanimous decision. His own appointees sided against Bill Clinton in that case. The court across the board said that Bill Clinton as president had no immunity just because he happened to be the commander in chief. Fast forward to where we are today. It is unthinkable that the Supreme Court would ever issue a unanimous decision that directly rebuts the president of the United States' claims of power or immunity or authority, right? We know that there's always going to be probably 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 votes in favor of Trump. We know that Sam Alito is going to defend Trump's policies and Trump himself. We know that Clarence Thomas is going to concoct some dubious historical record to say why Trump gets to do whatever he wants. The tariffs case proved that Justice Kavanaugh, will just make some stuff up because he wants to rule for Trump. And to your earlier question, it folds back into this. This is a break from how the court has operated for many, many centuries. Like, Chief Justice John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, he regularly issued decisions that disappointed his allies in government because he felt that once he put on the robes, he had to be a neutral arbiter of justice. That sort of principle guided the court for years, and now it's gone. We just don't see it, especially among a bunch of the Republican appointed justices. And I mean, that's quite the boon for Trump, because most parties walk into the Supreme Court not knowing if they have anybody in their camp. Trump walks in knowing he's starting with 2 or 3 in his pocket, and it's not that much of a stretch to get to 4, 5, or 6. And I think that really degrades the court as an institution. It makes Americans wonder, understandably, why it gets to wield so much power when its members are unelected, why it gets to override the decisions of, say, Congress, right? And, the representatives of the American people, when it's really kind of acting like, in many cases, a fundamentally political apparatus that's just designed to help the party that put them in power in the first place.
And to your point, just last week, President Trump took the unprecedented step of going to oral arguments and sitting there during the birthright citizenship hearing. It seemed to be a not very subtle message to justices, especially those whom he had appointed, that he would like them to rule in a certain way. Is that a fair interpretation?
I absolutely think that's what was going on in that case. I think that Trump wanted to stare down the justices, and he specifically wanted to remind Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, who voted against him in the tariffs case, that, they're only where they are because he put them there, and to make them feel that they should owe him some loyalty or some allegiance. Now, I don't think it worked. I actually think it was quite foolish, and it shows he misunderstands the dynamic at the court, because this is one of those few cases where I think that justices like Gorsuch and Barrett are going to buck the president. And I think that his presence, if anything, reminded them that they really do need to stand up to him, at least from time to time, to remind him that they get to overrule what the White House wants to do whenever they want, because otherwise the Supreme Court stops being, part of an independent branch of government, and it's just some outpost of the executive branch that rubber stamps everything the president does. The 6 conservatives mostly want Trump to be able to, pursue his agenda. They don't want to do so at the expense of their own authority.